The morning I learned my own brother was trying to erase me. The courthouse smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper. I remember that smell because it didn't belong to the moment. It was too clean for what was about to happen to my life. I was standing in a gray hallway with my coffee cooling in my hands, staring at a vending machine that hummed louder than it should have. My phone buzzed once an email from my attorney, and I didn't open it right away. Something in my chest told me to wait, to breathe, to hold on to the version of myself that still believed family didn't draw blood. By the time I finally read the subject line emergency motion, bankruptcy filing against Apex Defense Systems, that version of me was already slipping away. I pressed my back against the wall and let the chill of it sink through my blazer. Apex. My company. The thing I built with blistered hands and sleepless nights. The thing I walked away from my family for. I didn't know yet that the name at the bottom of the filing was my brother's. But I felt it. Somewhere deep. Like a fault line finally giving way. Before all of that, before courtrooms and contracts and headlines, my life was quieter. Structured. Predictable in the way inherited wealth often is. I grew up in a house where the garage was bigger than the living room. My father, Robert Shaw, believed cars were a form of legacy. Luxury cars, to be exact. Imported engines, hand-stitched leather interiors. Deals sealed with firm handshakes and heavier expectations. Dinner conversations were always about margins, inventory, and which senator had been spotted at which fundraiser. My mother nodded along, refilling glasses, smoothing the edges of my father's certainty. Damien, my younger brother, absorbed it all like gospel. He had the charm for it, the easy grin, the way men leaned in when he spoke. I was the odd one out. I liked blueprints more than balance sheets. I liked understanding how things worked when they failed, how systems broke under pressure. When I was 16, my father caught me dismantling a security camera system we'd just installed at one of the dealerships. "You break it, you buy it," he said, not unkindly. "I'm fixing it," I told him, holding up a rewired circuit board. It was vulnerable. He stared at me like I'd spoken another language. That look followed me for years. I went to engineering school on my own terms, paid for it with scholarships and night jobs, and learned early how to live without asking permission. By the time I told my parents I wasn't coming back to the family business, the silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "You're throwing away security," my mother finally said. "No," I answered. "I'm choosing mine." Apex Defense Systems started in a converted warehouse with flickering lights and a heater that only worked if you kicked it. I hired people who believed in the work, not the prestige. Veterans who understood what equipment failure meant in real life. Engineers who cared more about durability than branding. We didn't chase headlines. We chased reliability. For years, the family barely mentioned Apex. At holidays, Damien would ask polite questions in that way that wasn't really curiosity. My father would change the subject. I learned to live with being the uncomfortable success story. Too independent to praise, too visible to ignore. Then came the contract. $89 million. A government defense deal that would put Apex on the map in a way I'd never allowed myself to imagine. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in my office, when the call came through with a Washington number. I remember gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles went white. After I hung up, I didn't scream or cry. I sat there and listened to the hum of the building, the distant clang of tools, someone laughing down the hall. I walked out to the floor and told my team. There were hugs, a few tears. One of our senior engineers just closed his eyes and whispered, "They finally saw us." That night, I called my parents. My father congratulated me in the tone he used with distant colleagues. My mother asked if the contract meant I'd be less busy now. Damien texted later. "Drinks soon. We should talk." I told myself that was progress. I told myself family pride just needed time to catch up. What I didn't know was that success, in some households, sounds like betrayal. The first sign something was wrong came quietly. Too quietly. Our CFO, Mark, knocked on my door one morning holding a stack of papers he hadn't asked permission to print. "Have you seen this?" he asked. It was a notice. A creditor inquiry that didn't make sense. Claims of unpaid obligations that didn't exist. "We'll clear it up," I said, already reaching for my phone. But more followed. Emails, calls, questions from partners asking if we were stable. I worked longer hours, slept less, told myself this was just the cost of growth. Then the summons arrived. That was the day I stood in that courthouse hallway, lemon cleaner in the air, reading words that felt unreal. Fraudulent bankruptcy claim. Petitioner, Damien Shaw, my brother, with my parents' names listed as supporting affidavits. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, ignoring the looks from passing strangers. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the slow, dawning, understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision, one they made together. And as the courtroom doors opened down the hall, I realized something else. Too, something steadier, colder, and unexpectedly clarifying. They had underestimated me, just like they always had. I didn't go home after the summons. I drove instead, no music, no calls, just the low whir of tires against asphalt and the city blurring past my windshield like it wanted nothing to do with me. I ended up at the warehouse, long after most of the team had gone home. The lights inside were dim, the kind of half-lit that makes shadows stretch and breathe. This was where Apex had learned to stand on its own. I walked the floor slowly, running my fingers along steel tables nicked by years of use. The air smelled like machine oil and burnt coffee. Familiar, grounding. When my chest felt too tight, I stopped beside the testing bay and leaned my forehead against the cool metal railing. Damien. I said his name out loud, testing it in the space. When we were kids, he used to follow me everywhere. I was the older sister who knew how to climb the fence without getting caught, who could talk our way out of trouble when we did. He used to watch me like I had answers he wanted to borrow. Somewhere along the line, that look changed. By morning, I had my legal team assembled. Mark sat across from me, jaw clenched, while our lead attorney, Helen Brooks, flipped through the filing with a pen tapping softly against the table. This isn't just aggressive, Helen said finally. It's sloppy. Sloppy wasn't the word I would have chosen, but I let her continue. These documents reference liabilities Apex has never carried. Shell vendors, phantom invoices. She looked up at me. Someone expected you to panic. I laughed then. A short, humorless sound that surprised us all. They expect me to fold, I said, because that's what they've always assumed. Helen studied me for a long moment. Did you know it was coming? No, I answered honestly. But I know why. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. Family resentment has a signature. You can feel it before you can name it. The first call I returned was to my mother. She answered on the third ring, breathless, as if she'd been waiting. Tori, she said quickly. This has all gotten very out of hand. Out of hand. Like a spilled drink. Like a misunderstanding. Why are your names on the filing? I asked. There was a pause. I could hear the television in the background, some daytime talk show. The audience laughter tinny and misplaced. Your father and I were advised it was the best way to protect the family, she said. Protect it from what? I asked. Me? Another pause. Longer this time. You built something risky, she said softly. Defense work is volatile. Damien filed a fraudulent bankruptcy claim. I cut in. My voice was steady, even as my hands trembled. He accused my company of insolvency weeks after a federal contract was awarded. My father took the phone then. I could tell by the way the air shifted. You didn't have to humiliate us, he said. I closed my eyes. This isn't about humiliation, I replied. It's about control. You walked away, he snapped. You think there aren't consequences? There it was. The truth, finally spoken without disguise. I hung up without saying goodbye. In the weeks that followed, the ground beneath Apex shook, but it didn't break. We complied with every inquiry, produced every record. Helen's team dug deep, tracing the origin of the forged documents with methodical patience. The deeper they went, the uglier it became. Damien had used old vendor names from the family car business entities he assumed would sound legitimate to a cursory glance. He'd copied signatures, fabricated debt schedules, and somewhere along the way, he'd grown careless. He'd used the wrong font. It sounds small, almost laughable, but that detail cracked everything open. The font hadn't existed at the time the document claimed to be created. From there, it was like pulling on a loose thread. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I focused on my people. I called an all-hands meeting and stood in front of the team, feeling the weight of their eyes, their trust. I didn't sugarcoat it. There's a legal challenge to the company, I said. It's personal, and it's baseless. A murmur rippled through the room. We're not going anywhere, I continued. But I won't lie to you. This will test us. One of our junior analysts raised her hand. Are we safe? She asked. I met her gaze. Yes, I said. And I promise you, I will protect this place the way I've protected it from day one. After the meeting, people lingered. Someone brought me coffee. Another squeezed my shoulder in quiet solidarity. That night, when I finally went home, my husband, Eli, was waiting. He didn't ask questions. He just pulled me into his chest and let me breathe there until the tension eased enough for words to form. They're trying to take it, I said eventually. I know, he replied. But they don't know you. Court day arrived with gray skies and the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. Damien sat across the aisle in a tailored suit I'd seen him wear to weddings and charity events. He didn't look at me. My parents sat behind him. When the judge entered, the room stood as one. I watched the lines on her face as she listened, sharp, attentive, unimpressed by theatrics. Then she looked at Damien's attorney. Counsel, she said, are you aware that Apex Defense Systems is the recipient of a recently awarded federal defense contract? The air shifted. Damien's head snapped up. Helen didn't smile. She didn't need to. What followed was methodical. Evidence presented calmly. Dates aligned. Inconsistencies exposed. When the forged documents were displayed on screen, enlarged for all to see, I watched my brother's composure fracture in real time. His leg bounced. His jaw clenched. And for the first time since this began, he looked at me. Not with anger, with fear. The judge asked for a recess. It was a small mercy. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been scooped from my chest and left behind on the courtroom floor. In the hallway, Damien finally approached me. Tori, he said, lowering his voice, glancing around as if this were a private family disagreement and not a public unraveling. This has gone too far. I studied his face, the familiar curve of his mouth, the slight crease between his brows that used to appear when he was thinking hard. It was unsettling how easy it was to remember him as the boy who used to beg me to sneak him into my room when he'd had nightmares. You mean when you forged documents? I asked quietly. Or when you tried to bury my company? His jaw tightened. You don't understand the pressure I was under. I almost laughed. Almost. You had options, I said. You chose this. Our mother appeared then, her heels clicking against the tile like punctuation marks. She reached for my arm without asking. This is a family matter, she said, her voice tight. We can still fix it. I gently removed her hand. No, I replied. You can't. When the hearing resumed, the judge's tone was different, sharper, less patient. She questioned Damien directly. Mr. Shaw, she said, can you explain why these documents reference liabilities that your own accounting firm has no record of? He stumbled, paused too long, offered explanations that folded in on themselves. Helen requested the forensic analysis be entered into record. The wrong font, the altered metadata, the copied signatures. The judge leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses. This court does not look kindly on abuse of the bankruptcy system, she said, especially when it appears to be used as a weapon. I didn't look at my parents. I couldn't. By the end of the day, the claim was dismissed, referred for federal investigation. Damien's attorney whispered urgently to him. My brother nodded, his face pale, his confidence evaporated. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters called my name. I walked past them without stopping, Eli's hand warm and steady at the small of my back. The weeks that followed were surreal. Federal charges moved quickly. Fraud has a way of accelerating once it's exposed. Damien was indicted. My parents' business partners began to distance themselves. Old deals scrutinized under new light. The family car empire so polished, so untouchable developed cracks. I received a letter from my father. It was handwritten. The paper smelled faintly of his cologne. He wrote about legacy, about mistakes, about how things had gotten out of hand. He asked if we could talk. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I wasn't ready. The day Damien was sentenced, I didn't attend. I was at Apex, watching a prototype go through stress testing. The machine hummed, shook, held. Helen called me afterward. Convicted, she said simply. Federal fraud. He'll serve time. I closed my eyes. Not in triumph, in mourning. Because no matter what he'd done, he was still my brother. Apex, meanwhile, grew. The government contract opened doors we'd never knocked on before. We hired more engineers, expanded our facilities. Our valuation climbed, quietly at first, then unmistakably. $340 million. The number felt abstract. What felt real was the sound of laughter in the break room, the pride in my team's eyes, the knowledge that we'd built something resilient. At home, life changed too. I gave birth to our daughter, Isabel, on a rainy afternoon that smelled like clean sheets and antiseptic. When they placed her in my arms, small and warm and impossibly new, something inside me settled. This was family. I cut ties after that. Changed my number. Sent a final email to my parents. Brief and clear. I wished them peace. I asked for space. They didn't respond. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what might have been if things had gone differently. If pride hadn't hardened into resentment. If love hadn't been confused with ownership. But then Isabel stirs in her crib. Or Eli reaches for my hand. Or I walk into Apex and hear the steady rhythm of work being done with care. And I know. Some families are born. Others are chosen. There's a particular kind of silence that settles in after everything loud has already happened. It's not peace, not yet. It's the quiet of aftermath. Of standing in a room after a storm and noticing what's still standing, what's cracked, and what will never be put back the way it was. That was the season I entered after Damien was sentenced. People assumed I would feel vindicated, empowered, triumphant. Instead, I felt careful, measured. Like someone learning how to walk again after a long illness. Apex needed me steady. Every morning, I woke before the sun. The house smelled faintly of milk and laundry soap, and the baby monitor hummed softly on the nightstand. Isabel's breathing came through it in tiny, rhythmic bursts, my favorite sound. I'd stand there for a moment, just listening, reminding myself why I was doing all of this. At work, I kept my voice calm, my posture open. Leadership, I learned, isn't about never being shaken. It's about not letting the tremors spread. The press didn't let go easily. They framed the story the way they always do. Sibling rivalry turns criminal. Defense CEO exposes family fraud. They wanted anger, a soundbite, a villain and a victor. I gave them none of it. This was about accountability, I said in every interview, and about protecting the people who depend on our work. Somewhere in that restraint, I found my footing again. The public consequences rippled outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents' dealership lost long-standing partners. Banks called in audits. Employees, people who'd worked for my father for decades, started quietly updating their resumes. The business didn't collapse overnight, but it shrank. And with it, the certainty my parents had always worn like armor. One afternoon, months later, my mother showed up at my office, unannounced. The receptionist buzzed me, hesitant. She says it's important. I closed my eyes, counted to 3, then nodded. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair, once carefully dyed, had gone gray at the roots. She clutched her purse like a shield. "Tori," she said, voice trembling. "You look tired." "So do you," I replied gently. We sat across from each other, a wide desk between us that felt intentional. "I didn't know how far Damien would go," she said. "Your father didn't either." "You signed the affidavit," I reminded her. She flinched. We were scared. "Of me?" I asked. She looked down. "Of losing everything." I thought of the warehouse, of the nights I'd slept on a couch beside malfunctioning equipment, of the risks I'd taken without a safety net. "I built everything I have without taking from you," I said. "You tried to take from me anyway." Tears slid down her cheeks. "He's my son." "And I'm your daughter," I said softly. She reached for my hand again. This time, I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either. "I can't be part of this family the way it is," I told her. "Not anymore." She nodded, defeated. "I understand." I wasn't sure she did, but I let her leave with dignity intact. At Apex, we reached milestones that once felt impossible. New contracts, international partnerships, a second facility. I watched junior engineers grow into leaders, watched ideas turn into systems that would protect lives I'd never meet. One evening, as the building emptied, Mark stopped by my office. "You know," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "most people would have burned bridges." I smiled faintly. "Fire is unpredictable." He nodded. "You chose something harder, something cleaner," I replied. At home, Eli and I learned the rhythm of new parenthood midnight feedings, whispered jokes in the dark, the way exhaustion can feel like love when you're in it together. Isabel grew fast. Her laugh filled rooms, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine with startling strength. One night, rocking her to sleep, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Damien, not at my parents. Not even at the version of myself who'd once tried so hard to earn their approval. I was free. Freedom doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the absence of dread, in the steady pulse of a life aligned with your values. When Apex crossed the $340 million valuation mark, there was no champagne, no speeches, just a note I wrote to my team. "Thank you for believing when belief was costly. This company is what it is because of who you are." They framed it in the break room. Family, I learned, is not about blood. It's about who stays when staying costs something. The strange thing about survival is how ordinary it eventually becomes. You expect fireworks after you make it through something devastating. You expect a finish line, or at least a moment where someone hands you a medal and says, "You did it." But most of the time, healing happens in the unremarkable spaces during grocery runs, budget meetings, bedtime routines. Life, I learn, resume the quiet insistance. By the time Isabel turned 6 months old, the legal noise had faded into background static. The investigations concluded. The headlines moved on. Apex, once whispered about in boardrooms, was now spoken of with respect. Still, there were days when the past crept in sideways. Like the afternoon I found myself parked outside my parents' old dealership, engine idling, hands resting on the steering wheel. I hadn't planned to be there. My GPS had rerouted me due to construction, and muscle memory had taken over. The building looked the same, gleaming windows, a row of polished sedans angled just so, but the lot was half empty. I didn't go in. I drove away, feeling lighter for the choice. At Apex, we held a company-wide review, a full day of presentations, honest feedback, and long-term planning. I stood at the front of the room, Isabel's picture tucked into my notebook, and talked about the future. Growth is responsibility, I said. And responsibility means we don't forget who we are. Afterward, a young engineer named Luis approached me. My dad used to work for a company that collapsed because the owners got greedy, he said. This place, it feels different. I swallowed. That's intentional. The public consequence of Damien's actions lingered in quieter ways. Former family friends stopped inviting my parents to events. Old allies distanced themselves. The reputation my father had spent decades curating became a cautionary tale about entitlement, about overreach. I heard all of this secondhand. I didn't ask for updates. One evening, months later, my father called. I stared at the screen as it rang, my pulse steady. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short. No anger, no excuses. I hope you're well, he said. Tell Isabel. Tell her I said hello. I didn't call back, not out of cruelty, but clarity. The final court-related document arrived one crisp morning in early fall. A formal closure. Apex cleared of all claims. The paper felt heavier than it should have. I filed it away, then took the afternoon off. Eli and I took Isabel to the park. The air smelled like leaves and sunscreen. Children laughed nearby, the sound rising and falling like birdsong. As I watched my daughter reach for the sky, her whole body intent on the impossible task of grabbing clouds, something inside me softened completely. This was the resolution, not the conviction, not the valuation, but the knowing. I had built something that would outlast bitterness. That night, after Isabel fell asleep, Eli and I sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket. Do you ever miss them? He asked gently. I considered the question. I miss who I thought they were, I answered. But I don't miss the feeling of shrinking. He nodded. You don't shrink anymore. No, I said. I don't. At work, I started mentoring other founders quietly, intentionally. People who'd come from family businesses, people navigating betrayal and doubt. I never told my full story. I didn't need to. Sometimes, just saying, you're allowed to build something different was enough. Apex's success became a case study in industry circles. Not because of the scandal, but because of the recovery. Because we didn't fracture. Because we chose integrity when spectacle would have been easier. One afternoon, Helen stopped by my office. You know, she said, smiling. Most clients want revenge. I wanted peace, I replied. She nodded. You earned it. That evening, as I rocked Isabel to sleep, I whispered a promise I hadn't planned to make. You will never have to compete for love, I told her. Not here. Her eyes fluttered closed, trusting. Complete. And in that moment, I understood the deepest lesson of all. Success doesn't prove your worth, but it can give you the space to protect it. The last thing to settle wasn't the anger. It was the grief. Grief has a way of waiting until you're strong enough to carry it. Until the noise quiets. Until there's room. It came for me one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while I was sorting through old files in a storage cabinet I'd ignored for years. Blueprints. Early proposals. A faded photo slipped out and landed at my feet. Damien and me. We couldn't have been older than 10 and 12. He was missing a front tooth. His arms slung around my shoulders like I was his anchor. I stared at the image longer than I meant to. I sat down on the floor and let myself feel it. Not the betrayal, the loss. I cried quietly, the way adults do when they don't want to be found. When I was done, I placed the photo back where it belonged and closed the drawer. Some doors are meant to stay shut. That evening, Apex hosted a small internal gathering, nothing formal. Just food trucks in the parking lot and long tables strung with warm lights. The team laughed, shared stories, introduced families. I watched from the edge. Isabel tucked against my chest in a carrier. Mark raised a toast. To Tori, he said, for building something that didn't exist and protecting it when it mattered. There was applause. I nodded once. That was enough. Later, a woman from logistics, someone I didn't know well, approached me. My sister tried to sabotage my business last year, she said quietly. Watching you. It helped. I touched her arm. You're not alone. As the night wound down, I realized something else had shifted. I wasn't carrying the story anymore. It no longer defined me. Apex entered its next phase with intention. We invested in research, in people, in long-term resilience. We turned down deals that didn't align with our values even when the numbers tempted us, especially then. At home, we celebrated Isabel's first birthday with a messy cake and too many balloons. She smashed frosting into her hair and laughed like she'd discovered something holy. I watched Eli lift her into the air, both of them grinning, and felt something click into place. This is enough. I wrote one final letter. Not to send, just to release. I thanked my parents for what they'd given me. I acknowledged the harm they'd caused. I forgave them not to reopen the door, but to close it without bitterness. Then I burned the letter in the sink, the smoke curling upward like a quiet exhale. The world didn't change after that, but I did, years from now. Isabel will ask about her grandparents, about the family we don't see. I'll tell her the truth gently, age appropriately, without poison. I'll tell her that sometimes people choose fear over love, and that it's okay to walk away from what hurts, even when it shares your last name. Apex crossed another milestone quietly. A number that once would have terrified me now felt like confirmation, not of success, but of sustainability. I stood in my office late one evening, city lights flickering outside the window, and thought about the girl dismantling security cameras in her father's garage. She'd been right. Vulnerability matters. So does courage. I shut off the lights and went home, because that's where my life was. There's a question people ask me sometimes, usually in a quiet voice, when they think they already know the answer. Was it worth it? They mean the distance, the silence, the family I no longer sit across from at holidays. And I always pause before I answer, because the truth deserves care. Yes, not because I won, not because my company grew, not even because justice was served in a courtroom. It was worth it because I learned something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. Family that survives only if you stay small is not safety. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, but staying would have cost me everything I was becoming. Today, when I walk into Apex and see people working with purpose, when I come home and hear my daughter laugh from the other room, when I sit beside my husband in the quiet after bedtime and feel peace instead of tension, I know I chose right. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped letting destruction wear the name of loyalty. And maybe that's the part I want you to sit with tonight. If someone you love asks you to break yourself so they can feel whole, if success turns into punishment instead of pride, if you're being told that forgiveness means surrender, would you still stay? Or would you choose the life that lets you breathe? If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a choice you're facing, or one you've already made, share your thoughts in the comments. You're not alone, even when it feels that way. And if you're carrying a quiet story like this inside you, stay a while. There are more voices here that understand.